Hi, and welcome to part 2 of how to make a Milkmaid dress that has a gathered bust. It has a tie string in the front. It has spaghetti straps. It has a slit in the front. It's midi length, and it has a zipper in the back. So in the first part of this tutorial, I showed you how to make the sewing patterns for this dress. So if you haven't checked that out already, then definitely head over to part 1. And in this part of the tutorial, I'm going to be showing you how to take all of the sewing patterns and put them together in order to make your Milkmaid dress. So let's get into it.
All right, so starting with this bed sheet that I never got to use because it was too small for my mattress, I'm going to be using this fabric to make my dress. So I put it down onto my table and I just traced the patterns from part 1 of this tutorial, and I made sure to trace it on the wrong side of the fabric, and I left a 1/2 inch seam allowance around the edge of each of the patterns that I traced. Alright, so these are the 5 pattern pieces for the front part of the top of my dress. I basically just connected the 3 center front pieces with a straight stitch, and when I did that, then I just gathered the bust cups, and there are about 5 different ways that you can gather fabric, but the way that I used the elastic method. So I basically just stretched a piece of elastic along the bottom edge of the bust cup, and then I did a zigzag stitch on top of the elastic. I do have a tutorial on the 5 different ways that you can go about gathering fabric, so definitely be sure to check out the link down below in the description box, or you can just directly click on the iCard here on the screen. So then after I gathered the bust cup, it looks something like this. So now I wanted to connect the bust cup to the actual center front piece. So I just flipped it on top of the center front piece with right sides facing, and I just pinned the edge of the bust cup to the edge of the center front piece, and I made sure to stretch out the bust cup a little bit just to make sure that it evenly matches up with all of the center front piece. And then after that, I did a straight stitch along the seam allowance line where the bust cup intersects with the center front piece, and it looks something like this. And then I'm literally just repeating the same step with the other bust cup, so just gathering the bottom of the bust cup and then connecting the bust cup to the center front piece with a straight stitch. Alright, so then this is what it looks like once the cups have been installed. And here I have 2 facing patterns. I made the facing patterns off camera, but if you want me to make a tutorial to show you how to make a facing pattern for your garments, let me know and I'll be happy to make one. But essentially what I did was I just traced the top edge of the bust cup, and I used that as my facing pattern guideline, and I just made my facing pattern about 2 inches long, and it includes seam allowance at the top and the bottom. And then I serged the edge along the seam allowance line for both of the facing patterns. And I did that off camera, so you don't see it serged here, so let's pretend that it's serged. And then after that, I just connected the right side of the facing pattern to the right side of the bust cup, and then I did a straight stitch along the top edge of the bust cup and the facing pattern along the seam allowance line. So here you can see that I'm doing a straight stitch right along the seam allowance line where the facing and the bust cup connect. And when it's done, it looks something like this. And then the next thing I did was I just kind of flattened out the facing pattern so that it could be right side facing up, and then I just folded over the edge of where the center of my dress will be, and then I just hemmed it with a straight stitch so that it was a clean edge. And then to create my drawstring channel, I just folded over that facing pattern and pinned it down, and then I just did a straight stitch along the seam allowance line on the bottom of the facing, and I repeated the same step with the other side, and it looks something like this. So to make my drawstring, I took 4 pieces of bias strips and I connected them with a straight stitch along the bias, and then I took that long strip of bias tape and I just folded it in half with the right side inside of the fold, and I pinned it down and did a straight stitch. And then I just turned it inside out to create a string like this. And then I cut the string in half to make 2 pieces. And then I took one piece of the string and I just used a loop turner to basically pull the string through that casing that I had made using my facing pattern. And then to prevent the edge of the string from getting lost in the casing, I just pinned down the end of the string and then I just did a straight stitch along that corner of where the string is. And then I just repeated the same step with the other bust cup. Then I took my back pattern pieces and I just serged all around the edge of each of the 4 back pattern pieces. If you don't have a serger, you can just use a zigzag stitch set to the shortest length. So then once I finished serging the pieces, then I just connected them with the right sides facing each other, making sure that the notch marks were lined up for each of the patterns. And then I pinned it down and did a straight stitch along the seam allowance line and repeated the same exact steps for the other 2 patterns for the back of the dress. Okay, then after that, I took my front part of the dress and I just folded over the edge where the armhole is, and I just basically hemmed the edge of the armhole with a straight stitch and repeated the same step on the other side with the other armhole. And then afterwards it looks something like this. So then I took my 2 back pattern pieces and I'm just kind of placing them where they need to go. And in order to attach the back piece to the front piece, I just matched them up, making sure that the bottom edge was matched up and aligned, and then I just pinned them down together so that the right sides are facing, and then I just did a straight stitch along the seam allowance line for the side, and I literally repeated the same step with the other side of the pattern. And after I straight stitched, it looks something like this. So then I took another set of 4 bias strips and I stitched them together to make one long strip, and I folded the strip in half and stitched it and then turned it inside out to make 2 strings like so. And then I just connected the bottom edge of both of the strings to the end of where that drawstring casing is, and then I just stitched it back and forth with a straight stitch so that will be basically the straps. So when I finished, it looked like this. So now I took my bottom pattern pieces for the front part of the dress and I lined them up like so, and I took the 2 side pieces and I sandwiched them on top of that center front piece so that the right sides of all of the patterns were facing, and then I just did a straight stitch along the seam allowance line for the 2 sides, and when I finished doing that, then it looks like one whole pattern piece like that. And then I took my 2 back pattern skirt pieces and I started by stitching the dart closed, and in order to get it stitched accurately, what I did was I made a line in the middle of the dart and then I folded the dart so that that line would be on the crease, and then I just pinned down the dart and then I did a straight stitch along the diagonal line of the dart and repeated the same step for the other dart on the other pattern panel. And then I took my front part of the dress and I just sandwiched it on top of those 2 back pieces and made sure that the right sides of all of the pattern pieces were facing, and then I just pinned it down into place, and then I did a straight stitch along the seam allowance line on both sides of that skirt pattern. And when I say skirt, I mean like the bottom half of the dress, which is basically a skirt. And then I stitched it, and then after that it looked something like this. And this is basically the bottom half of our dress that we just need to connect to the top half of the dress to make one full dress. So what I did then after that was I just serged the raw edges of that bottom half of the dress I should have serged each of the patterns individually, but I didn't do that, so I just went ahead and serged all the raw edges. But for that area where I wanted to put my slit, I separately serged the flaps so that I could later on go ahead and open up the slit without having to reserge anything, if that makes sense. I hope it makes sense. Then I took the bottom part of the dress and I flipped it so that it was right side facing up, and then I took the top part of the dress and I sandwiched it on top of that bottom pattern, and I just made sure that both of the pattern pieces were right sides facing, and then I just pinned down the edge. And before I stitched, I just opened up the pattern to make sure that all of the seams from the top part of the dress were lined up with the seams at the bottom of the dress. And this is important because it'll look bad if it's not lined up, basically. So once I made sure that everything was lined up, then I went ahead and I refolded it, and then I did a straight stitch along the seam allowance line where the top and the bottom of the dress connect, and it looks something like this. So here you can see that all of the lines, all the seam lines are like vertical and in line, and they look great. So the next step basically was to just close up the back of the dress with a zipper. I followed a really great tutorial on how to install an invisible zipper, so I will leave the link for that tutorial in case you're curious about it. After I installed the zipper, I then folded over the top edge of the back of the dress to kind of create a sort of casing for the top edge of the zipper, and then I did a straight stitch along the seam allowance line of that top edge, and it looked nice and clean like this. So then I just closed up that open area underneath the zipper by turning the dress inside out, and then I just made sure that the two flaps of the fabric were right sides stacked on top of each other, and then I did a straight stitch along the seam allowance line. And when I finished, it looked something like this, nice and clean. So the next thing I did was I went back to the straps for my dress, and I just measured. So I tried on the dress and I measured and marked where I wanted to cut the strap. So I used a safety pin to kind of mark where I wanted to cut it. And I just cut both of the straps. And then once I finished cutting the straps, I just pinned the bottom edge of the strap to that seam right on the opposite side of the zipper inside of the dress, and then I just straight stitched it back and forth inside of the top edge of the dress on top of the seam, and then it looked something like this. So my straps are sewn down in place like so, like that. And then the next thing that I wanted to do was I wanted to try the dress on, and I measured and marked how high I wanted my slit to be. So then I just went to my dress, to the bottom of the dress, and I just started opening up the seam, and then I stopped at the mark where I want my slit to basically start. And this kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about just individually serging the two flaps, so that way I could easily open up the seam like so. So the next thing I did to hem the opening of my slit was I just went in about an inch from the edge of the opening, and then I just created a crease and slid my hand up all the way to the top of the slit, and I let the fabric naturally fold, and then I pinned the fold. So again, I just went in about an inch away from the edge, and then I folded that area and made a crease all the way up to the opening of the slit, and then I pinned it down, and then I did a straight stitch along the edge of the slit on both sides, and it looks something like this. And then the final thing that I did was I just hemmed the bottom of my dress. So you could either hem the bottom of your dress with a double fold, or you could do what I did, which was I just serged the bottom edge of the dress, and then I folded the serged area, and then did a straight stitch on top of the folded area. And this is what it looks like. This dress is so amazing. I think this is my favorite thing that I've made all season. If you love it as much as I do, leave a heart emoji down below in the comment section. And if you have any questions, definitely leave those questions down below as well. And remember that all the materials I used for this video can be found on my Amazon storefront, and the link for that is down below in the description box. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one. Ciao.